Welcome to Grappling with the Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making to help us more clearly see both sides of complex issues, better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Jonas Goldson, and I'd like to welcome my guest today. With me is Sam Ardery, who is a national mediator, trial lawyer, consultant, speaker, and author. He teaches negotiation at Indiana University's Maurer School of Law and is author of Positively Conflicted: Engaging with Courage, Compassion, and Wisdom in a Combative World. Mark O'Brien is founder and principal of O'Brien Communications Group, a B2B brand management and marketing communications firm, and host of The Anxious Voyage, a syndicated radio show about life's trials and triumphs. And Kelly Paxton is a certified fraud examiner, former private investigator, professional speaker, podcast host, and author of Embezzlement: How to Prevent, Detect, and Investigate Pink-Collar Crime. Thank you all for being with me today.
Thank you.
A pleasure.
And
yes,
here
it
is our topic. The horror of California wildfires has seized attention all across the country. Over 40,000 acres burned, over 12,000 homes and buildings destroyed, 24 deaths, families displaced, and lives shattered. Adding to the tragedy is how many of the homes lost were uninsured. The combination of overvalued real estate in high-risk areas and government-imposed premium caps compelled many insurance carriers to cancel homeowner policies, in some cases just a week before the fires ravaged the county. Those seeking to cast blame have pointed to a systemic water and forestry mismanagement problem, as well as Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass approving an $18 million cut to the fire department budget. What seems not to have been a factor was the government's policy of diverting water to protect endangered fish. The reports of dumping water into the ocean when it could have been used for agriculture sparked considerable debate earlier this year, but this apparently contributed in no way to the current crisis, despite the claims of Donald Trump. Meanwhile, Kamala Harris reportedly condemned insurance companies for refusing to honor current policies, a claim that seems equally unfounded. The first order of business is fighting the fires, protecting those in danger, and supporting the victims in rebuilding their lives. After that, however, the question becomes how to prevent future tragedies. Considering how these fires are becoming more and more frequent, why have the root causes not been better addressed? Just as bad, what are we to make of well-intentioned policies that make matters worse? What drives leaders to ignore the real issues while disseminating misinformation? And what should we be doing about it? The floor is open.
I just want to start by saying you, Jonason, have said on more than one occasion that we live in a post-truth world, which makes me ask the question, what are the real issues?
Am I supposed to answer that?
Well, I appreciate the question, the way you've asked it, and Mark's question as well. Anytime we're talking about a tragedy and complexity that underlies it, I think about people I've known that were surgeons and pilots, and what they will say often is there's enough redundancy and enough protection in systems like that where we know bad things are going to can happen if things are done wrong, that they almost always survive one mistake. Two mistakes, there is sometimes a consequence, and three mistakes, it's often a devastating consequence. And I think in things like this, and this kind of goes to Mark's question, what are the real issues? We all trust some communication that's given to us, right? I mean, maybe not completely, but we decide simply by where we get our information, whether it's from the statement you gave of the facts, or what news station we watch, or what Substacks we read, or whatever else. And I think Mark's question is really, really important, because once we believe something from a source that we've decided we trust, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to listen to anything that contradicts us. It becomes literally physically painful.
All I think of is Danny Kahneman's work on System 1 and System 2, the short-termism, where everyone is about short-termism. I mean, I specialize in embezzlement, workplace dishonesty. Everyone thinks money is going to solve the problem. And that's why they initially start stealing. Money might solve it initially, but long term, you either have to, move out of that expensive house, whatever it is. But we just live in such a fast-paced world that, and not to get all political and everything, but everything is short-termism. I mean, you know, even investing in retirement plans these days, we sit there and go, okay, are we going to actually ever retire? And behavioral scientists have found ways to make it so people will contribute. So long term, they will be able to retire. But especially in politics, everything is short term. Everything is the next election. I just got to make it through the next election. And like a lot of the losses were, you know, they were even homes that were green. Julia Louis-Dreyfus has been very, very proud of her house. She built a green house a long time ago. Apparently it was destroyed. And again, like people should have metal roofs. Well, those are too expensive.
Yeah, one of the articles I read, it said that as soon as these fires are out and it's not headline news anymore, then we just go back to the default. I mean, you just reminded me as you were talking, Kelly, and I grew up in LA, and I remember 1977 was the heaviest rainfall of that century at the time, and there were mudslides all over. The same areas that are burning were now when they're having mudslides. And over the years, people had built houses on stilts. They were on these steep slopes, and many of them um, are not around anymore. Sometimes because of the mudslides, sometimes because of earthquakes. And you don't see them very often when you drive out there because either the insurance companies wouldn't insure them, or people just got smart enough to stop building them. You hear the stories about the Florida coast that people would build houses in hurricane territory, and because they were insured, they didn't care. As long as they could get out and be safe, they'll just rebuild them afterwards. And now I got the same type of thing with these areas that are there's so much brush. They're so prone. I mean, we used to have wildfires out there, but it was once every few years and it was always in the summer. Now it seems like it's every year, even in the winter. And so at some point, will people say, this just isn't working? Let's do something else? Or is it's such a nice place to live? Well, it's like that scene in Garp, the chances of another plane flying into this house are astronomical.
Um, it doesn't make me terribly happy to say that Kamala Harris was apparently correct in saying that some insurance companies had declined to honor existing policies. And I know this for, among other reasons, I happen to be writing a blog post for a client. And I'll just read you something that I found, believe it or not, from Reuters. U.S. insurance stocks slid on Friday as analysts estimated insured losses from the wildfires menacing Los Angeles could reach as high as $20 billion, potentially making it the costliest disaster in California's history. Analysts are evaluating the financial impact of the disaster, with J.P. Morgan doubling its forecast of insured losses to over $20 billion. Wells Fargo also expects similar insured losses and said the total economic hit from the disaster could be well above $60 billion. Here's the relevant point. To help provide critical stability amid the devastation caused by the fires, California Insurance Commissioner Ricardo Lara invoked moratorium powers to suspend all policy non-renewals and cancellations for insurance companies for 1 year. So apparently that was happening.
Was that the same? That was a little too technical for me at the end there. Is that this? I mean, I thought her claim was they're not going to pay out to people holding policies.
I think that's the same as canceling coverage.
Well, if cancel, it couldn't be canceling coverage moving forward. I don't see how that could be legal.
Well, I think that's a whole other issue.
Well,
Good
and
thing
I
Sam's here.
well, and to be clear, I know none of the facts. So I mean, I know what gets reported different places, so I know none of the facts. Um, but I think kind of going to what you've both said and the short termism, what is easy to forget when the tragedy is in front of us, whether it's the hurricane or whether it's the fires, and is that difficult problems exist in tension. So if we talk about, I mean, I agree that money doesn't solve every problem, and yet money is a decision maker in things. And if we go to all metal roofs in the midst of what is already a housing crisis for people that don't have much money, those things coexist, and they're difficult problems that, again, I wouldn't claim to have the answer to. One of the things that I think is really difficult in having the conversation is wherever anyone stands, politician, insurance adjuster, claimant, victim, wherever it might be, um, it's so complex. We want to say the problem is because it gives us the illusion that then there's control and there is an answer. When it's like Maggie Jackson, who wrote the book Uncertain, says uncertainty is wisdom in motion, and yet there is uncertainty, and we want. I mean, I've made it. Every person that's come to me in thousands of mediations, and this is one of the few things I will say that is there is no exception to. They've all had something happen that they didn't expect, and they think they've been treated unfairly. They don't get to me otherwise. They've been through self-help, they've been through informal counseling, they've been through lawyers, they've been through filing the pleadings. They only get to me after all that has happened. And it's and these can both be. I mean, I can go and eat both rooms, and they are perfectly fine people, deeply vested in their sense of justice and fairness, and they couldn't disagree more. How do you have those conversations? I think that's the question for all of this.
Are you guys familiar with Margaret Heffernan?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
So
not.
she's great. She's over in the UK. Well, she bounces back and forth. She has this whole thing about super chickens that that's how I got to her. But I think it was her most recent book. Yes, Willful Blindness. Yes, awesome. Oh, you and I probably have the same library. Um, uh, is that, you can have complicated problems, but complex problems are a whole different thing. And the fires or any natural disaster, there's complications, but really it's complex. And that's where, it becomes difficult because, yeah, sure, the government could say, you have to have metal roofs. You can't have, certain things within a certain meters of your house or something like that. But then there's a housing shortage. So that's complex. Like, how do you get people back into their houses in a safer manner, in an economical manner? Like, there's a picture of a house standing that was a recent or architect design home. Everything around it was gone, but this house, the eaves, kept the eaves short or not deep because the ashes or, the embers go up. So there's
Mhm.
things that we could do, but also like roofs. I mean, how much more is a metal or a tile roof than cedar shake? And does the insurance company give you a benefit for doing that? No. I mean, I'm sure they'll say they will, but my sister lives in LA and she lives in a rental home. And after she is safe and everything like that, I said, "Do you have renter's insurance?" And she said, "Yes. However, it doesn't cover wildfire." And so then I started thinking, I live in a high risk fire area. I'm like, I wonder if my house is excluded from wildfires. And if it is, what am I going to do about it? Like, it's my biggest asset.
Well, and isn't it true that some insurers in Florida refused to write flood coverage? I mean, it's crazy. And Jonason, I want to point out that in your intro you said something about government imposed premium caps. I was talking to a gentleman, I'm not going to name any names, um, who founded a company to calculate replacement values for residential properties. And he uses satellite technology and all this stuff. As a matter of fact, while I was talking to him, um, he did a replacement valuation on the home I lived in at the time, and I couldn't believe how accurate the report is. Insurance companies won't let him use that because if they were going to insure for actual replacement value, the premiums would be so high they're afraid nobody would buy it. So if it doesn't matter if you have the coverage, if your home, for example, burns to the ground, the insurance company's not going to give you replacement value for it.
And that's what lawyers get paid for. I mean, I've mediated lots of those cases. And it's kind of like appraisers in condemnation cases when the government's taking property and things. I mean, there are standards for appraisers, but the same appraisers looking at various factors, depending on who's hired them, can reach very different decisions. And the same happens with replacement cost. And what tends to happen is if people can't agree, and it happens a lot in fire cases, happens a lot in flood cases, if there's coverage, is everybody hires their experts. They show up, they evaluate each other's experts, and 2 or 3 years later, sometime before it gets tried, it gets mediated. And the challenge is, and I don't want to completely beat up insurance carriers, but the challenge is in those cases, the insurance carrier can always afford to lose more than the individual. The individual is has a very different decision-making paradigm because if they're wrong, then they can't go back at it. Where the insurance company is looking at the law of averages, say we've got, even in California, we've got say 10,000 claims, and if we fight all of them, we won't have to fight all of them. But if we do, we're going to win X percent of those because the law of numbers will play out for them just like it does for a casino boat. They're not the village idiots when it comes to evaluating losses. And so it's the one place I've never in mediations never found an ability to level the playing field because the high money player, whether it's an insurance company or somebody else, can always afford to lose more than the other.
Well, sure, and that's when litigation becomes weaponized
Yeah,
because the person
absolutely.
who can afford, you were telling us, Kelly, $3 million from an insurance company. How can ordinary people combat that? But Kelly, I'd like to go back to a point you made. You made a distinction between complicated and complex, which I find fascinating. Could you elaborate on how you see the difference between those two?
Complicated, I see myself, it's a bunch of pieces you have to put together. It's kind of like a puzzle, and the pieces all fit, but they're different colors, they're different patterns. Complex is more like, a 3D puzzle. And if you put this wrong piece here, then all the rest is going to fail. So it's kind of like playing, like they say, the smart tech bros, they're playing 4D chess and you're playing checkers. And it's like complex is there are so many moving parts and they're changing consistently. Whereas complicated, it's just difficult, but they do fit. Is that how you saw it, Sam, when you were listening or reading?
I think it's a beautiful description of it. Because in complex, everybody agrees what the pieces are. They may disagree on how they need to fit, and there may be some pieces that can go different places. But complex, they don't even agree on what the pieces are that are needed to try to fit the puzzle together. They don't even agree on the 3D puzzle. And that's where the leverage piece, I haven't seen the show, but I'll look forward to watching it. That's where leverage comes into play because when I do lawsuits for decision making, I literally hold up my hand. I say, there are 5 things we're talking about in all these rooms. The chances of winning and losing, which is an imperfect prediction process, what a good day might be, what a bad day might be, what does it cost to get there, and what are the personal preferences and priorities that might lead one side or another to be more inclined to want to resolve or to try a case. Those are the 5 things. No matter which room you're in, those are the 5 things that come into play. And so, and if people can agree on that, then we can at least find out where the complexity or where the complications lie.
Well, and okay, again, I don't want to make this political or anything, but we have, Luigi Mangione in health insurance. So my sister who lives in LA, who is very, I'm going to say, let's call her forward thinking. She's very involved in the community and everything like that. And she wrote me some stuff and she goes, things are going to change. And I really think that there is a groundswell. Now, I live in Oregon. I would love to have Vancouver, Washington, Oregon, and California all be their own country. And, people have jokingly said that for a long time. But I kind of think between health insurance and this insurance, something has to change. And it is going to be complex. But like, I just don't think the people are going to stand for it.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating thing to contemplate because, on the one hand, you just have to, I mean, any thinking person has to say there has to be a limit at which people say no more. Except experience does not really indicate that. There's a note here from Eric who asks, in a case like this, with so much demand for things like building materials, will it be harder to calculate and mediate those expenses?
I think
Sam,
pain,
is that
I think pain, yeah, I mean that's what mediators and lawyers do all the time. And I think pain will dictate. When I talk about those five things, it may be that an insurance company can endure more pain of process than somebody who needs their house. And so they may think with their expert or whatever that they're entitled to $1 million, but they're living in a motel with three kids and at $300 a night, and they got to get some kind of structure up. And that's a different kind of pain than the pain of simply, writing checks and figuring that out. And I part of what comes into play, and this is why people smash government or criticize government a lot. There are places for regulations because I believe, this is personal opinion, that a completely free market does not solve things because once you've got somebody so far on the high end of the free market, they can control that and it's not simple supply and demand anymore. So the answer to Eric is those are hard problems. They get solved. People looking at them, we all think we're objective, right? We all think we have the right amount of common sense. So people can look at that same scenario and one say, well, this is a fair solution. Somebody else says that this is a fair solution. And that's why I talk about the justice gene and positively conflicted, because we all have it and we know when it's tweaked. We may not even recognize it until it gets tweaked.
And isn't that your point, Sam, about leverage? I mean, ultimately, the people with the most money are going to have the most leverage. And Kelly, I would love to know a little bit more about what your sister means when she says that things are going to have to change. And I have my own perspective on that. I'll share that in a moment.
So, my sister has a friend who literally closed on a house December 28th and it burned down.
Oh,
They're a young couple and, it's probably not going to be covered. And what draws communities together is tragedy. And I am seeing stories of tragedy and the tragedy is also from all different groups of life. Like you've got young people, you've got older people, you have children who are now going to be homeless. Like there is this combined, we have to help each other. And I mean, again, I don't want to go all crazy here, but like look at some of the people who have donated money right off the bat versus the others who have not given a dime. And I think that there is going to be a groundswell of something. Um, and it's not even, I don't want to say it's political, a groundswell. I think it's just disappointment and just incredible. Can you imagine working years to get a down payment on a house and 2 weeks later it's gone and you're uninsured? And the bank still, I mean, I read, and granted it was on Threads, it probably was true, but I'm not 100% sure because there's no fact checking anymore, is that someone had a contract with ADT and they called to cancel it because their house is burnt down and they're like, you have a contract, pay. It's like, this is where, you know what? People need to be human. They need to be human. And we were talking pre-show about what does it take a person to say, I won't be part of this machine. I mean, I have the luxury of not having to be part of a machine, but 20 years ago, did I? No.
It's to echo Sam's point. It's it's hard not to bash either the government or the insurance companies in conversations like this. Um, you know, the health insurance department that I worked in for the insurance company I mentioned before we started to record, excuse me, I was there from 87 to 95. And I knew then that the line between health insurance and health care was disappearing. So it's hard to blame the insurance companies for all the impositions that have been placed on them. The other thing that occurs to me, and I think both of these issues have to do with psychology, if the government is taking more of our money because they think they're better at determining what should be done with it, I think most of us are going to be less inclined to part with more of it if we don't have to. And I'll just, this is one of my favorite examples. I'll just cite public television. You know, whenever my wife and I watch something on public television, they always say something like, and this program is made possible for donors just like you. And I always interrupt and say, by suckers just like you, because the Corporation for Corporate Broadcasting, that's not what it's called. Corporation for Public Broadcasting gets somewhere in the neighborhood of, at least this fiscal year, $660 million. So you're already getting that in tax money. I won't call it revenue. And you still want private contributions.
Everyone wants more money.
Well,
Yeah.
and I would say in the government, insurance, personal issues that come into play, I would argue that the single biggest problem is trust. And what is hard to keep in mind is if we trust somebody with our money, we expect them to be perfect. When we lawyers have contributed to the problem because we look for the exception where it may be 98% trustworthy, but 2% not. And then the lawsuit gets brought and we know 98% of them settle. So they're back to leverage. Leverage gets it done. But when you think about whether it's the coding that hospitals do or that doctors do, and all of those things, and you all are the fraud experts, not me, but I mean, most of the laws that I look at, I was a prosecutor years ago, they weren't made for most of the people. The laws were there for the people that weren't following the laws. I mean, most people aren't committing violent crime, right? And we've got penalties. And so if we're going to trust and we're going to choose trust, we have to remove some regulation and assume some people are not going to be trustworthy. There's going to be a certain percentage of doctors, hospitals, insurance companies, whoever it is, who are not going to be trustworthy. What our comfort level is with that is really difficult to decide, and who's going to pay the price for that, personal or financial.
Well, let me take off on that because one of the topics I was hoping we get into, and again, I only know, like Will Rogers said, what I read in the papers, but I did my best to try and find the facts of this story. And what appeared to be the case was that California government had imposed premium caps to prevent insurance companies from gouging their customers. Well, sure, that sounds good, unless that's preventing the insurance companies from charging enough to cover themselves in a high-risk situation, which is what reportedly happened. Now, you know, as far as insurance company goes, I use USAA. My father was in the military, and so I was grandfathered or father, I guess, fathered into that. And you know, we had a tree branch come down in our backyard and took out our kids' swing set. I called them up. They told me what to do. I did it. I filed my request, and literally within 5 minutes, the money was in my account. It was absolutely remarkable. Now, we didn't have to worry about where we're going to live. And some people do, and that's horrible. But that's certainly not the story you hear all the time. And so certainly there's good reason to want to control insurance companies. But here you've got a case of unintended consequences. You pass well-intentioned legislation that ends up causing people to be abandoned and left without protection. I was thinking about things like minimum wage laws. Sure, we want people to get paid a decent wage, But when small businesses that are counting on occasional help, they can't afford to pay these people that price, so they end up cutting people. So now the people, the 80% or 70% that are still working are getting a better wage, but the 30% aren't getting paid anything. So the well-intentioned legislation that is solving one problem is creating another problem that may be much worse. And when you talk about trust, Sam, isn't this part of trust? Trusting the people making the decisions, and as you said, Kelly, to not be focused on the short-term gains, but to have a sense of vision. What are the long-term consequences?
When's the last insurance company that you saw go bankrupt? The United Healthcare CEO made over $10 million. His president, or the CEO, makes 23 million. His president makes 10. Like, that's insane. The only reason they're making that money is from denying claims. That is why they are making that kind of money. And it's ridiculous to me that, they're doing it on the backs of people.
And I don't want to suggest this is common practice. I don't know if it is or it isn't, but I know people who worked in claims departments who told me, I'm sorry, we are trained to say no, first response. And Jonason, what you were just saying a moment ago makes me wonder, does unintended equal unforeseen? Because I mean, if you've been on the planet for any length of time, you have to know that if you're going to cap insurers' premiums, you should understand that means that they're also not going to have adequate claims reserves. And I was reading something again because of what I do for a living. Do you know what FAIR plans are? FAIR plans, right? I mean, they're like assigned risk pools. California's FAIR plan is underfunded in the billions of dollars. So whatever ultimately those losses are, they're going to be spread among California insurance companies anyway.
Well, the reports are that the fair premiums are way higher than normal premiums, and the payouts are much lower.
Well, sure they are. I mean, I would equate it to, I don't even know if it's called that anymore, but in Connecticut, there used to be something called the assigned risk pool for auto insurance. And the same thing was true. The premiums were astronomical, but it was the only place you could get insurance.
Well, and where are we going to? And I think I want to be careful about becoming cynical about this, but when we can't even agree on the source we can turn to get the facts, it becomes really difficult to even get everything on the whiteboard of all the things that are complex, as Kelly talks about it, to factor into that. And there's a woman who teaches at Northeastern University. I wish I could remember her name, but I can't. And she said our brains are wired to be drawn to negative and novel. And when you look at social media or you look at tragedies when they happen, and then, I mean, think how quickly it goes. I mean, we've come to just school shootings get what, maybe 24 hours, depending on numbers and other things. I mean, as tragic as they are. And I hope your sister is right, Kelly. But what I wonder is, as big as California is, as much publicity as it gets, how long will it be enough in the forefront that there's a big enough groundswell to make any kind of meaningful change? And there may be, and I hope it is, because people after a while get tragedy fatigue. And so if somebody's living in flyover country like I do, we have our own issues, but they're not as big as the issues in terms of that we don't have as much natural disaster tragedy as there might be on any of the coasts. And so people hear those things, and kind of the blame comes up a lot. Is they're quick to go to blame because we don't like to think we caused the problem. We like to think somebody else caused the problem. So we'll get into victim blaming and all those other things that come into play. It is 5 or 6D chess when we can't even agree on where we're going to get the facts.
Well,
I
it's
think
like
it might have
loss
been.
aversion. We're
I
more
think
scared of losses. Sorry. We're
No,
more
no,
scared
no,
of
I'm sorry.
losses than we are of gains. Like you remember a loss more than you remember a gain.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
I think it was George Carlin who asked the question, what's the difference between realism and cynicism, Sam? That line's getting blurrier too, I think.
Well, and I live at a community, I live at a pretty conservative state, but in a town that's pretty progressive within that state. So there's a lot of political headbanging. And so one of the things, so we face housing issues as well. And sometimes the people that are most biggest advocates for providing affordable housing, if you try to put affordable housing behind the nice house they live, they'll still fight against it. I'm not in that situation, so I want to be careful not to throw stones, but that seems to be the human nature part of the problem. Who's going to pay the
Maybe
price?
not in my backyard.
I saw a news story about some gentleman in New Haven, Connecticut, in the construction business, was building small homes for homeless people. And they had on this news story people who were living in there and saying, thank God this man saved us. I mean, my children and I would have had no place to go. And the next person in the story was the mayor of New Haven, who was saying, no, 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 we can't have this guy doing this. It's got to go through all of the bureaucratic hoops before we can say, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. It's
Yep.
just, oh, self-defeat.
Yeah, that I think is a whole other show.
Yeah, yeah. Well, no.
The National Review had a piece where they sort of told California's rankings in terms of pretty much everything, and it's all down in the cellar. Yeah, I suppose it's just that the state is so wealthy that they can sort of cover or conceal or offset this apparent mismanagement. And yet, as you say, Kelly, we want to think that at some point people will wake up and say, enough is enough. This has to change.
I look at real estate a lot. I'm like a crazy house person. And, the Wall Street Journal has or New York Times also has houses in Indiana versus Seattle versus California. The one thing I always look at is property taxes. And then when they compare property taxes in the US to, say, Portugal, where everyone's fleeing to, it's like Californians pay a lot in property taxes, not only on the value of the house. You
Oh, yeah.
can't get a house for, under a certain amount of money, but those property taxes, they're a lot.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, California is the fifth largest economy in the world.
Yeah.
And, I think, and then with the upcoming change that we're having soon that we shall not talk about, what about migrant workers? Who likes guacamole? You know what? You better start freezing it. But the rebuilding where I live, Hispanics, I don't know if they're documented or undocumented, they are the best framers in my town. So who's going to rebuild California?
Yeah, this is my daughter and son-in-law live out there, and she's a doctor and he's an accountant, and their household income is 3 times what ours is. And they can't even dream of owning a house.
Yeah.
It is so far beyond anything within reach for them.
If my sister could even afford a down payment, she couldn't afford the taxes. I've explained to her. I'm like, what you're paying in rent pencils out so much in your advantage. Like your rent basically covers this woman's taxes. So you'd have to pay taxes and then the mortgage. It's like, just be happy you're living in a $4 million house and you're only paying X amount of dollars per rent. I mean, it doesn't pencil.
Some of us may remember Prop 13 from the 70s, but I remember my dad saying that if this does not pass, we are going to have to sell our house. Because it was already, I think he was paying $6,000 a year, and that was in 76 or something. And it was going to double the next year. So I don't know what happened. That they've now worked around it or repealed it.
Well, Jonas, and I wanted to, before I don't know when we're going to end, but I wanted to at least address your last two questions.
Yeah, please.
What drives leaders to ignore the real issues while disseminating information, and what should we be doing about it? I would argue the leaders talk about what they do think the real issues, because the real issues for them are what it takes to get elected. And we decide that. And so I think in terms of that groundswell, the groundswell needs to be, what do we do to communicate to those elected officials what we think the real issues are when we don't have a $100 million lobbying group? I think that's one, because I do think they talk about the issues. The real issues for politicians are the ones that get them elected. And unless we communicate to them differently about what the real issues are, the same thing's going to happen. And in terms of what should we be doing about it, I think it's like the starfish story. If your neighbor's house burned down, you give them a place to live, you share your food, you take care of the kids that aren't taken care of, you take in the pets. And I think if we get, or if I get so cynical that I'm unwilling to help that person I see in that starfish and say, okay, it helped this starfish, it doesn't solve the whole problem in California, then I'm going to go down that cynicism loophole or whirlpool, and I'm going to stop caring about all of it because I get too fatigued. And I think it's important for us to remember that there are things we can do, and we need to own them.
I,
You
I
know,
really
that
like
makes
that,
me,
Sam, and I think it's a nice place to end before we go to the second segment. But you remind me of, at least you did remind me before it went flying out of my head again, that, there was a study I read a number of years ago where they had a picture of a girl who was clearly Middle Eastern looking, and they they showed her to people, and then the picture, they said, we're collecting for this girl. She's an orphan, she's impoverished, and if you donate this much, we can provide her with this, that, and the other thing. And then they went to a different group of people, and they said exactly the same thing and showed them exactly the same picture. They just added one sentence. They said, she's one of thousands of girls in need. And adding that one sentence caused the donations to plummet.
Yeah.
For exactly, I think, the reason you're saying. We give because we want to make a difference. And if I can look at one person and say, I'm making a difference in one person's life, then I feel good about it. Then I want to do it.
Yeah.
But if I feel like whatever I'm contributing is just a drop in the ocean, then why should I bother? And I think that is a mindset, and I'm really glad you framed it that way, Sam, because I think that's a mindset that we really have to change, because it's and that's where cynicism comes from, Mark. What can I do to make a difference? That's not the point. The point is for me to do what I can do, because ultimately that's all I can do. One, it's good for me. Two, it's helping somebody somewhere. And three, if someone else notices that I'm doing something, maybe they'll do something. And that's how grassroots movements start, and that's how groundswells come about. And
Well, and
yeah.
look at our demographic and our age. I joke, I live in my bubble. Like, it's taken me a long time to get my bubble, but I'm in my bubble. This is not representative of California. We are not representative of them. And that's where I think the groundswell could happen, because they're not in their bubble.
Yeah.
Their bubble has been popped.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone's bubble is different. So I have a line. And if certain things happen, I'll push out of my bubble.
And I think we all have to try to do that. I mean, I think that's what diversity and inclusion is all about. It's making connections. It's looking from other people's point of view. And it's taking responsibility for ourselves and not requiring somebody else to legislate that we get out of our bubbles, because that's not going to work. Well, thank you. Really thoughtful. I mean, we did a lot of venting here. Um, uh, but often just trying to see the issues more clearly, help us have a greater sense of where we can direct our efforts. And I think I think we ended on a strong note there. So thank you, Sam Ardery, Mark O'Brien, Kelly Paxton. Appreciate your time, your thought, your insights. And for those of you who are watching, would like to hear more of this conversation, you can go to my Substack, and premium members there have access to the backstage conversation that will happen right after this. Aside from that, if you have an idea for a topic that you would like us to take up on a future episode, please go to my website, ethicsninja.com, use the contact information, submit your idea if it's compelling. We will take it up on a future episode. And until then, as always, we encourage you to continue grappling with the gray.